Hey everyone, and welcome to this town hall with Assemblymember Robert Rivas. My name is Luis Morante. I'm the Legislative Director for California YIMBY. Thanks so much for joining us. We are having just a hint of technical difficulties behind the scenes connecting some of the lines here, so I hope you'll bear with us, but we wanted to get started and sort of do some of the introductions to get us kicked off. So as I mentioned, my name is Luis Morante. I'm the Legislative Director for California YIMBY. We're an organization that advocates for housing policy at the state capitol that helps California end its housing shortage. And we're really excited today to be joined by Assemblymember Rivas to talk about some of the bills that he's working on that really align with this mission. We're going to be talking about a couple of his housing bills, and we're also really excited to hear more about what he's working on for farm workers in California. As someone who grew up in farm worker housing himself, Assemblymember Rivas is really well positioned to talk about both of these issues. And so I'm really excited to be opening for him today. It's an honor to have him with us. And I really hope that you'll be able to take some stuff home with you today, that you'll be able to learn, that you'll be able to use in your advocacy efforts. Joining us today, we're very happy to be co-hosting this event with some really wonderful organizations. Joining us today is Debbie Arikel from Habitat for Humanity California. I'll let her introduce herself more. And Robert Apodaca from the 200. I'll also let him represent or introduce himself a little bit more. Debbie, do you want to welcome us as well?
Sure. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm so honored to join this town hall on behalf of Habitat for Humanity California. And we really appreciate the opportunity to work alongside California YIMBY and the 200. I'm Debbie Arikel, and I'd also really like to thank Assemblymember Rivas for his leadership on housing legislation for working families, especially his efforts to create lower priced homeownership housing. Habitat for Humanity, as many of you I hopefully know, is dedicated to homeownership affordability for low-income Californians. We're a nonprofit home builder and lender, and we have a network of 40 Habitat affiliates that are spread throughout the Central Valley, as well as rural, suburban, and urban communities statewide. Every day, we are at grassroots level witnessing the struggles of hardworking parents who simply can't find decent housing that they can afford because it doesn't exist. And all of us want and deserve a place to call home. And the pandemic, we all recognize, only magnifies the challenges of those who do not have the security of safe housing that they can afford. So, on the bright side, we're proud to witness the success of thousands of Habitat homeowners throughout California. We've seen over decades how this is a life-changing opportunity and what that does to be able to afford a home, achieve stability, and build equity. And that's really why I'm especially excited to be part of this town hall meeting and why Habitat supports smart housing legislation so more Californians can actually live and work and support and invest in their communities. So I'm really pleased to be here. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Debbie, and thanks for joining us. Can I hand it off to you, Robert, to introduce yourself and the 200 a little bit more and kind of what brings you here today?
Sure. Thank you very much, Louis. And I'm really pleased to be part of this historical moment for myself to be in this live webinar with so many friends. And I also want to acknowledge one of our Leadership Council members from the 200, Denise Pinkston, who will be answering some questions later this afternoon. Our organization, California Community Builders, also known as the 200, are working very hard at closing the wealth gap through home ownership. And these last, we were a home builder at one time, but that is such a challenging task that we decided we'd be better off being advocates for home ownership. And hopefully you'll be able to see some slides, a few slides of some homes that we built in Fireball, California. And so those were some home ownership townhomes that were sold to some very low income people. I believe that to qualify, you had to be at 30% AMI. Anyway, the 200 has been lobbying for home ownership opportunities throughout the state. And mostly we've been focusing on removing a lot of the state regulations that are adding to the cost of home ownership. And quite frankly, we're big advocates of housing production of homes at all income levels, but we're particularly concerned about home ownership opportunities for a lot of working families, for a lot of young families who are just being priced out of this market. And so I look forward to being part of this webinar this afternoon.
Thanks, Robert. Robert, Debbie, we always love working with you in the Capitol and outside of it on advocacy efforts here. And so it's really just an honor to be joined by you today. Wanted to thank you again. For those of us just joining, or those of you who weren't able to hear me because I was cut off apparently, we're experiencing just the slightest technical difficulty behind the scenes here in getting Assemblymember Rivas's audio connected. So we're working diligently to try to get that up and running. So please bear with my apologies for some of the delay here. I'm also really excited to be introducing today our moderator, Ms. Sosan Madinat. She's a lobbyist with Lighthouse Public Affairs and represents both Habitat for Humanity and California YIMBY quite admirably, I would say. She's going to be moderating the panel with Assemblymember Rivas, but I thought maybe we could just open while we're still kind of waiting for his audio to connect, maybe with just a little bit of information about what we're going to be talking about today, and maybe Sosan can provide a little bit more background on her than I already did. So Sosan, welcome.
Great, thanks Louis, I appreciate that warm introduction. So as Louis mentioned, my name is Sosan Madinat. I am an advocate at Lighthouse Public Affairs here in Sacramento. And I am thrilled to be participating in this webinar today. I really appreciate everybody joining us and having the opportunity to speak to Assemblymember Rivas about the efforts and all of his hard work as it relates to farm worker housing and housing generally as a whole. He's been a tremendous advocate for organizations like Habitat for Humanity, California, the 200, and California YIMBY, which is why all of us are here today. So I've been working on housing legislation in Sacramento for the past 2.5 to 3 years, and have been working, very diligently on trying to expand access for home ownership opportunities, as well as creating space for additional housing that is more affordable, whether it's home ownership or rental. And we are grateful to be joined by, one of our champions in the Assembly, in Assemblymember Rivas. And I'm just going to make sure if he's actually with us right now before I jump into his bio. Assemblymember.
Hey, Sosan, yes, can you hear me?
Great. Yes, absolutely.
Fantastic. I really apologize for the delay, having some technical problems. I made the decision because I have an event here where I have to film some census message after this. And so I made the decision to drive to my office, which is about roughly, without any traffic, about 20 minutes from my home. But for some reason, there was a bunch of traffic on the road. And so
not a problem at all. We actually were just finishing up introductions. And so I'm going to jump in and introduce you now, Assemblymember, that we have you. Thank you so much for joining us. And again, apologies to everybody who's tuned in for the delay, but I'm just going to jump right in. So Assemblymember Rivas grew up in San Benito County within Assembly District 30, so a local of the community that he now represents. As a boy, he watched his grandfather fight for farm worker rights alongside Dolores Huerta and Cesar Chavez. Inspired by his grandfather, Assemblymember Rivas chose to pursue a career in public service. And after working his way through college and obtaining a master's degree, Assemblymember Rivas worked for Assemblymembers Simon Salinas and now Senator Ana Caballero. Assemblymember Rivas first ran for office in 2010 and spent 8 years on the San Benito County Board of Supervisors. During that time, he also taught at Gavilan College and worked as a student support manager at San Benito High School. Now as the Assemblymember for District 30, he works on various committees, including agriculture, appropriations, government organizations, local government, and rules. And he lives in Hollister with his wife, Kristen, and 3-year-old daughter, Melina. And as I mentioned at the beginning, he has been a huge, strong advocate and champion for all types of housing. And we're really thrilled to have him here today to talk a little bit about the farm worker housing package that he has. So Assemblymember, if you don't mind, I'm just going to jump right into the first question that we have for you.
Yes, let's do it.
Great. So you represent a district centered around the Salinas Valley, some of the world's best farmland located just south of Silicon Valley. Can you talk a little bit about how the housing crisis is affecting your district with that in mind?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, really appreciate the opportunity to be here. You know, YIMBY does incredible work. And so, you know, obviously as a first-time member of the state assembly, this is still my first term. Obviously, very thankful for organizations such as YIMBY as we carry this debate about housing forward. So certainly I'm very lucky to say that I'm probably one of the few members of the legislature that can actually say that I grew up and have lived in the district I represent my life. You know, as I've mentioned many times, if someone were to ask me as a child that I would someday be serving in the legislature, I wouldn't have thought it possible. Because, you know, when I look back at my life experiences, having been raised by immigrant farm workers, having lived in farm worker housing, having grown up in poverty, I didn't know I was poor because I was raised by such a loving family. But it was that roof over our head, however inadequate it was a tiny, small, 2-bedroom tract of migrant farm worker housing that we lived in. It was overcrowded. I lived with 10 members of my family because I was raised by my mom, who's a single parent, and my grandparents. My grandfather would labor in the fields for over 50 years for a company in South San Diego County called Almaden Vineyards. But he would, you know, work in the same fields where we lived because our house was actually on the site of that vineyard. And so certainly having grown up in this environment, having seen you know, a lot of the pressures that our region has faced, you know, this is probably you know, in my opinion, a hidden gem in the state of California. This district I represent is the 30th Assembly District, includes the forgotten parts of the state of California. And I say forgotten because when you think of Monterey County, people tend to jump and think of Pebble Beach or the city of Monterey and the peninsula. But in fact, the district I represent includes the eastern part of Monterey County, which is the Salinas Valley, some of the most productive agricultural land in the world. We produce about 2/3 of all the leafy greens to the world that come out of this valley, and also represent Watsonville in the county of Santa Cruz, in the southern part of the Silicon Valley, in the county of Santa Clara, Morgan Hill, and Gilroy. And then I myself am from San Benito County. And so this is a region that is dramatically underdeveloped. It's incredibly beautiful, a lot of open space, a lot of rolling foothills. And so certainly when you think of this crisis that we have in this state, housing crisis, that has really impacted the quality of life of everybody. It is really, it is resulted in an incredible amount of pressure for not only low income families, but for middle class families. And this is a district where we haven't had the level of improvement to our roads, the infrastructure, but certainly it's a desirable place to live because it's so underdeveloped, and it's a lot of the communities in this district are family friendly, and so certainly you've seen a whole bunch of growth. You have seen a lot of pressures to develop in our region, which is certainly extremely important as we move forward to meet our housing goals. But at the same time, is it smart growth? And it really has exacerbated this NIMBYism in this region because people have experienced things that they haven't experienced in the past. We see a lot of the gentrification, inflated housing prices, incredible commute times, where we are considered part of this San Francisco kind of region. Where we lead the nation in the number of super commuters we have. People that spend more than, I believe, 90 minutes or more in their car per day. where from a study that was cited from 2007 to 2017, that number has increased by 180%, which is extremely unacceptable. But us in this region that's so dependent on agriculture and farm workers, families such as myself, the housing crisis is incredibly acute, where you have families, farm worker families, that make the lowest wages. They're bereft of important, health benefits and unemployment insurance. There's an estimated around 100,000 farm workers and their families that live in this region, where local data, local study highlighted this problem of critical overcrowding because they can't afford rents. They certainly can't, make their way into the housing market. And so in Monterey County, the study cited that, this statistic of people per dwelling on average in Monterey County, it's about 3.2 people per dwelling. If you're from a farm working family, that number is over 7. It is a big problem. And so you have farm workers that live in third world country conditions here, in the golden state of California, living in, trailers, living in 4 or 5 families to a single family home. Mother Jones carried an article a couple of years ago that highlighted one case where there were 40 people living in a single family home. And with that are the consequences to children, where this is a region that has incredible student homeless problems, where, in the part of the district I represent, where 1 in 12, or in the 12 schools, 1 in 10 students is classified as homeless. And really, the impact to, the future of these students is a huge problem. And it's a concern, not only for myself, but it should be a concern for all of us. Because as I mentioned, growing up in farm worker housing, it was that roof over our head that, certainly provided myself the opportunity, provided my family every opportunity. And to know that children now aren't going to have these same opportunities is really, really a problem. So.
Well, thank
Sorry
you
for the long-winded answer.
No, that's okay. Thank you for giving us that, thorough answer. It's really helpful to hear more about your background, and, the angle with which you're approaching this issue has a lot to do with, the perspective that you have, and we really appreciate hearing that. I have a follow-up question to that, but very quickly before I jump to that, I just want to remind folks that if you have questions, please make sure to use the Q&A chat box. We've got folks monitoring and are able to answer those questions for you in real time. So follow-up question to your point, farm worker housing is a big issue, but it's one that, is generally under-discussed when we talk about the housing crisis. And given your experience, can you tell us a little bit more about AB 1783, the Farm Worker Housing Act of 2019, that you introduced and passed last year, so folks have a better idea of, what was involved in that and what that does?
Yeah, and so I appreciate the question. And so I'll try to be as concise as I possibly can. But certainly, when I was elected to the legislature, certainly I understood the need to remain flexible. Prior to my time in the assembly, I did spend 2 terms, 8 years as a member of the Board of Supervisors in San Benito. And there on the board, certainly you campaign on a platform. I recall as a supervisor campaigning on a platform of economic development and, infrastructure and jobs and whatnot. But as soon as I got in there, the second month of my time in office, all of a sudden the environment became a priority for me, and so certainly, and so I cut my teeth as a county supervisor, really becoming an environmental champion, fighting for the what became the first ban on hydraulic fracking in the state of California by an initiative process. And so when I came to the legislature, certainly as a candidate for state assembly, I talked about my values. I talked about, issues and policy areas that were important to me. But then when I actually was sworn in and into office, it quickly became apparent that, my focus was going to be on housing because so much of the issues we face as a state and as a country comes down to housing, our poverty problems, our environmental problems. And so certainly, and then clearly with my background, understanding the need to represent this region that I've called home my entire life, the most glaring problem that I noticed was how this housing crisis was impacting rural communities, and certainly the district I represented. And all of the discussion of housing and homelessness and this housing crisis that the state was facing was really driven from an urban perspective, which I can appreciate, but rural California needed to be part of that discussion. And that's why our farm worker housing bill was our primary bill last year. It didn't get much attention, probably because it's not a sexy topic, but for all the reasons I mentioned in my introduction, just how this housing crisis has impacted rural California, and in particular, the district I represent in farm working families. It is absolutely unacceptable in this golden state, this land of opportunity that I grew up hearing about from my grandfather, who told me, hey, hard work is going to create all the opportunities you need. If you work hard, you're not going to have to live in farm worker housing. You could go to college, you own your own house. And my grandfather was right. But when I look back on that experience, it was the fact that we had housing security. Even though it was not, the most beautiful and luxurious facility, it was a roof over our head. And that's more than a lot of students and a lot of children have today here in our backyard and in the district I represent. And for me, I certainly can't tolerate talking about being the 5th largest economy in the world, being less than an hour away from the Silicon Valley, this hub, the most affluent hub probably in the world. But you have children living in cars, living in trailers, in overcrowded conditions. But again, our bill was all about data. I'm a data-driven person, and there was a study that was done. It was a farm worker housing and action plan that was prepared for the Salinas and Pajaro Valley in San Benito County, which highlighted this problem. As I mentioned, the critically overcrowded the conditions that these farm workers face each and every day. And the study also identified the need not only for farm worker housing, but for housing that was going to be farm worker family friendly. So I believe the study called for the development of over 35,000 units to alleviate this overcrowded problem. And so our bill, what it set out to do is we created a mechanism to streamline the development of agricultural housing on agricultural land, because as we all know, when you talk about housing regulations and so many rules and controls that are imposed, it's nearly impossible to get any kind of housing built these days. And so our attempt was, certainly it's not a silver bullet. It wasn't going to solve this problem, but it certainly was the first step. It was a step in the right direction. And so what our bill essentially proposed is to streamline the development up to 36 units for workforce agricultural housing for farm workers on agricultural land. It was an opt-in program where growers or farmers that didn't want to utilize this program didn't have to. But at the same time, you have this Joe Cerna fund that provides funding specific for farm worker housing through our state budget. And being able to utilize those funds, draw on those funds to get these homes built. At the same time, you streamline that process. Certainly, there's a CEQA streamline, but we certainly working in the spirit of CEQA, we set certain environmental conditions that have to be met. But certainly, we're talking about significant reductions in time, significant cost savings in order to get homes built for farmers on agricultural land.
That's great. Thank you for giving us that explanation. That's wonderful to hear, and we look forward to seeing more of those developments come forward as the bill, has recently been enacted. So I'd love to talk a little bit about the current crisis and pandemic that we're in right now, and ask you a little bit about how that has overlapped with the farm worker issues. So farm workers also face particular challenges around coronavirus currently. So you've introduced the California Farm Worker COVID-19 Relief Package. How would that address the needs of farm workers in the current public health crisis that we're facing right now? And I know there are a few bills in the package, so
yeah. So right, and so I appreciate the question, and really, when you think of the situation that we're in. Certainly when I reflect on my background, my experience, and my grandfather who worked in the field for 50 years, it's great that President Trump and, our government has, they have classified farm workers and the agricultural industry as essential. The fact that farm workers are essential, but certainly I knew well before any type of classification that farm workers have always been essential. I saw my grandfather work day and night in the field, and certainly understand the importance that farm workers have, not only on the lives of their families as they earn the lowest wages, as I mentioned, they do so without guarantees of health insurance, not eligible for unemployment, the benefits that other employees, and so certainly, but also how important farm workers are to our food supply, to our food security. And I think that's something that we have always probably taken for granted, but now in a pandemic, as we rush to the store and we see empty shelves, these are farm workers that currently are risking their lives, their health, their safety, and that of their families, to ensure that we all that are sheltering in place have food, and we have the produce and a healthy food supply to get us through these very challenging times. And as I've mentioned several times, the need, the package of bills that myself and my colleague Eduardo Garcia introduced is a first in the nation type of package. No other state, no other, at the time, not even the federal government, have proposed to create a package of bills that highlight the need to protect our farm workers. But certainly when you look at how vulnerable farm workers are, they are the most, in my opinion, the most vulnerable labor population, not only here in California, but in this country, where this is a group of people that cannot even take the precautions during this pandemic. The way that they live, as I've mentioned and highlighted, these critical overcrowded conditions, they cannot, social distance. They can't quarantine if they, if they come down with this illness, if they experience symptoms, further threatening the people they live with and their families, and every aspect of their lives, they aren't able to follow these CDC guidelines of social distancing. The way that they live, the way they travel to and from work in crowded buses, the fact that they live in close proximity. And the one defense that we know, and have been told to prevent illness and outbreak is wash your hands, hygiene. And so, work sites, I think, now you're seeing more and more work sites that have hand washing stations available. But, certainly, ensuring that we're protecting our farm workers is critical at this time. And that's why we have introduced these bills. And when it comes to housing, I have consistently on 2 occasions pushed our governor as a member of the Latino caucus. We had the opportunity to have a video conference with him where I highlighted this problem, really appreciate his efforts, his administration's efforts to roll out a couple of programs. One was Project Room Key, to rapidly shelter our homeless population in the state by procuring and securing hotel rooms, motel rooms, by utilizing trailers. The governor also rolled out a program to protect frontline healthcare workers, which is great, who are serving on the front lines, as we all know. That way their families are protected. They can secure hotel rooms if they experience symptoms, if they are asymptomatic carriers, that way they can expose their families. But what about farm workers? And that's what I had mentioned to the governor, is what about farm workers? I would really hope that the administration would give the same consideration to such projects to provide temporary housing to our farm workers who desperately need it. So that way they can, 1, be safe, but 2, to ensure that there's no disruption to our food supply. As we have seen in other states where the meat packing industry has been shuttered because of a massive outbreak, the last thing our country needs, the last thing our state needs, is an outbreak in agriculture amongst our farm workers, because that would certainly threaten all of us. And so some of the bills that we have introduced around workplace safety, economic security, Again, housing, we are certainly working very, very closely with Speaker Rendon and his staff, with Assemblymember Ting and his budget staff, to request that monies be directed to expanding that project Room Key to include agricultural workers.
Great, thank you. So we have a couple follow-up questions about a few of the bills that are within the package.
Yep.
AB 3153. So we want to talk a little bit about some of the housing specific bills, and I know at least one of these is in the farm worker housing package. So let's talk a little bit about AB 3153. It would promote more sustainable transportation and development by easing parking requirements on new homes in exchange for additional bike or car share spaces. How did this bill come about, and where did this idea come from?
Yeah, I think that, so, really briefly, I think, this bill certainly, if you look at the language of the bill, and certainly anyone is welcome to contact our staff, Alejandra Garcia, who I believe is on this call. Feel free to reach out to her and we can get you any additional information about this bill as far as like a fact sheet. But certainly this bill, it may not be very broad in scope. But it certainly gets to the issue of parking minimums. And I say that because, parking minimums, the obvious problem that parking minimums create too many parking spaces. I really, have to give a shout out to my good colleague and my great friend, Buffy Wicks. Look forward to working with her on all things housing and all things related to these parking minimums. I know she, I think, had introduced a couple bills around this issue. But what's important about the relationship Buffy and I have is we are aligned when it comes to housing. And what's so unique about that is she represents an urban part of the state in the city of Oakland and Berkeley, and I represent a rural part. And so we understand the needs around housing and how it's important to talk about these type of issues that are going to allow for smart development, and is going to allow us to move the needle when it comes to production and concentrating growth where we desperately need it to allow us to meet our housing goals. But in this larger debate about California's housing crisis, the role of mandating car parking minimums, they get far too little attention. And that's why I love this bill that we've introduced, because the convenience of parking minimums or off-street parking spaces, what we tend to forget is it promotes driving. Even in our largest cities that have efficient and expansive these public transit systems. The second part is that these parking requirements, they reduce the number of actual livable units, which ultimately drives up the costs and causes these affordability problems that we've been experiencing. But the third point is that mandating parking spaces can displace the potential in a lot of cities where we desperately need new units. It can really it displaces the potential for ground level retailers and really boosting economic opportunities in our cities. And really, this should go without saying that off-street parking, these parking mandates, they aren't very attractive. It's an absolute eyesore. And so certainly when you look at this bill, I'm very proud that this was an idea from a local constituent, a very active constituent, someone who's become a close friend of mine over the years, over the last 2 years. His name's Zach Hilton from the Gilroy area in our district. And so we had this program, There Ought to Be a Law, and staff came to, we had hundreds of people that submitted ideas, and staff came to me and said, hey, we have this great idea about bike parking. It came from this guy from Gilroy. And so I randomly said, it's not Zach Hilton by chance, is it? And they said, yeah, actually it is. And so this idea came from him. We looked at it and we modified it a bit, but certainly the idea was his. And the whole idea behind this effort is to increase the amount of secure bike parking that is going to be available in new buildings and in cities and areas where we have new development. And so certainly what this bill proposes is that that there will be the option for these developers to meet at least up to 30%, I believe, of their parking requirements through bike and car sharing parking. And so obviously this is, our attempt to encourage alternative uses when it comes to mobility. And then obviously, having the opportunity to encourage people to utilize car sharing, to get on the road using a bicycle, certainly is a step in the right direction, but also start to chip away and start to educate people about the importance of thinking how parking minimums play into our overall housing crisis. And, and certainly, what it comes down to is being innovative in our approach to housing in this state.
Absolutely. I think it's great that, this legislation can help promote, reduction in the use of cars and also make it easier to build. So we think it's a great bill, and we really appreciate you championing this issue. So I wanted to jump to the next question. AB 3155, this is co-sponsored by the 200 and Habitat for Humanity California on the line. So I know they're very excited to be participating today and to be, involved in this legislation. So this bill would help streamline the production of new moderate income housing. What are some parts of California where you see the development of smaller scale home ownership housing being especially beneficial? And why are you passionate about this specific bill? I know that it's one you care a lot about, so we'd love to hear your thoughts on it.
Right. So, and so I appreciate that. And I really feel very passionate about this bill in particular. It should go without mention that, obviously we're facing unprecedented times, but this is certainly no time, although our state is going to face an incredible amount of fiscal pressure, where our budget is going to take a significant hit, because this is a pandemic that has affected each and every one of us. But one thing that we know is our housing crisis is only going to get worse. And so we cannot, this is the wrong time to turn away from addressing these significant housing issues that we face. And I think that when you look, over this pandemic, I finally have found the time to get some reading done. And I would encourage everybody to read a book that was just released. It's called Golden Gates by Connor Doherty, I believe, which really talks about this fight for housing in America, but it's really concentrated in California. And he highlights a lot of the problems that we face, and kind of talks about the history of housing in this state. And really, when you look at the history of housing controls in California in particular, one can certainly argue that such controls and such regulatory programs that you have seen developed at the local level, that these regulatory programs certainly have always been created and intended to achieve something. But now, myself included as a legislator, we have to question whether these regulatory programs or these historical housing controls that have been sustained over time, whether they are actually achieving their original intent. What is it that they are achieving? Because now here in 2020, what history has really highlighted is that the benefits of housing controls in this state seem to be mostly symbolic. Whether it's parking minimums, as we just talked about, whether it's single family zoning, whether it's the housing, what's the word I'm looking for? I'm sorry, I'm blanked on a word. Well, if I think of it, I'll come back to it. But really, the efficacy of these, this regulatory framework, the efficacy of these controls, what studies and data have, what they suggest is that the benefits of these controls and regulations are very small, that the costs to residents and consumers are enormous, and the inequities are unmistakable. And so certainly here we are in 2020, where housing has absolutely exacerbated our poverty problem. Housing has become a luxury and great investment for the wealthy. And this has happened at the expense of working families. It has happened at the expense of the middle class. It has stifled any attempts for localities to experiment and introduce innovative housing concepts. And that's why I love the bill that we've introduced, working with Habitat for Humanity, because certainly introducing a concept where we can be truly innovative with our housing and the way that we think about housing, and the footprints of these types of housing, being able to think differently about our density. That's the word I was looking for. Mm-hmm. But because at the end of the day, when we think of housing, we can't think of it as some investment, as this luxurious investment for the few. We have to think about housing in terms of opportunity. As I mentioned, when I reflect on my own life and having that roof over my head, that meant everything for the opportunities I've been given. And so when we think in terms of housing on the basis of providing opportunity, we've got to be able to build homes in this state that reflect that need, that can certainly ensure that we are doing everything we can to make housing affordable, affordable for people in this state, in the sense of, the constraints that people have on their incomes, and, make them economically feasible and affordable to get into a home. Because when more and more people are spending over half of their income on housing, that's not sustainable. And that's just, further exacerbates the problems that we have in this state. And that's why we lead the nation in the rate of poverty here, in our state. And so certainly, that's the one thing I like about our bill, is really introducing this different type of concept, thinking differently about housing. And although, the bill that we propose would apply to units of, or projects of 10 units or less, certainly it's a start. But really introduces an important concept of thinking differently about housing and meeting our housing goals, but most importantly, creating opportunity for first-time home buyers and for people to get into these entry-level homes, to have adequate and dignified roof over their head.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. That's great. So one of the questions we've received from the audience, so despite enhanced tenant protections and economic assistance, right now, many renters have lost a significant amount of income as a result of the pandemic, and some may not have received state or federal benefits, or may not be eligible for those benefits. What is the state doing to prevent an eviction crisis once the enhanced tenant protections expire? And how can we share some of those resources with folks?
Right, and so I can't comment specifically about what what is out there now. The Assembly is set to reconvene our session on Monday, May 4th. And so certainly, this has been a crisis that has been managed by Governor Newsom through executive order, which has been challenging in itself. And so certainly I know there's a lot of, my colleagues, so many champions when it comes to ensuring that our tenants are protected, ensuring that, this housing debate continues, that they have really been fighting for this issue as we've been on recess. I know that there have been a couple of bills that have been proposed around this issue. I can't comment on them specifically, just because, I have certainly been, really focused on this issue, on issues pertaining to agriculture. But certainly feel free to reach out to our staff as we get set to reconvene, around these important issues, and see what more we can do as a legislature to work with the governor to ensure that all people are being have the supports and certainly have the protections. Because as I mentioned, this pandemic has really impacted everybody, and so certainly working with banks and working with the financial industry is critical, something that the governor has done, but certainly I recognize that more needs to be done.
Absolutely. And I know, as you mentioned, we're seeing a lot of bills that have recently been introduced or recently amended as a direct response to the crisis. And I think, quite a few of those are directly targeting and focusing on tenant protections, renter protections. And so, as the Assembly member said, really encourage folks to continue to keep an eye out I would say it's important to, subscribe to the California YIMBY newsletter and any other newsletters, and reach out to the Assembly Member's office directly to inquire about those specific pieces of legislation as they move forward. And as you mentioned, Monday is the first day back, so we should know more in the coming weeks. So another question we have from the audience, is the state or even at the local level, do we know if anything is happening right now to decompress some of the crowded housing in response to the pandemic? And do you have any information that you can share on that?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Yeah, sure. Is the state or potentially at the local level within your district, do you know if there's anything happening right now to kind of help alleviate some of the crowded housing in response to the pandemic?
Yeah, and so certainly that is a great question, and it's certainly something that we have been closely monitoring, and as I mentioned, something that we have pressed this governor and his administration on, because not much has happened. When you talk about the needs around agriculture, around, as I mentioned, the critically overcrowded, the conditions that farm workers face and agricultural workers face, we haven't received much relief in the sense of the actions that have been taken by the governor to ensure that healthcare workers have the opportunity to shelter in place and quarantine by utilizing temporary housing options like hotels and trailers. If anything, Cal OES, local jurisdictions here in Monterey County, the city of Salinas, they were guaranteed a certain number of trailers to be utilized for temporary housing. But we did receive the trailers, but it was not the numbers that we were guaranteed. And so that's a huge problem. And so certainly we understand that this is an unprecedented crisis, that this is a large state, that there are certainly a lot of needs, but we'll continue to push. As I mentioned, we're working closely with, my colleagues, with leadership in the legislature to ensure that agriculture is included in Project Room Key, which was, again, this effort and program to rapidly shelter homeless people in this state. And we think agriculture needs to be a part of that program.
Wonderful, thank you. And then have you given thought on, and you've touched upon this in some of your previous answers, but have you given thought to how COVID-19 will have an impact on housing and home ownership specifically? And, 3155 was introduced prior to the pandemic, but very clearly, has a direct nexus to an opportunity for recovery and relief as we come out of the pandemic. I'm curious to know, what other thoughts you've had on that issue and how COVID is impacting housing and home ownership generally.
Right. It's a great question, because certainly the aftermath of California, the economic toll that this is, that this crisis is going to have on service levels at the state and local level, the impact it's going to have on families. This is a pandemic that, again, has really changed the way we interact, the way we live, the way we work. And so when you read those comparisons, that this is not only that this crisis not only resembles that of the Great Recession, but of the Great Depression, it should worry all of us. And certainly when it comes to housing and creating opportunities for home ownership, the need and the crisis isn't going to go away. If not, it's just going to be exacerbated by this crisis. And so certainly when you think of the aftermath and how we move forward, especially when it comes to housing, this was supposed to be the year of production. And I think that we certainly have to keep pushing, but certainly doing it strategically and having this broader conversation throughout the state. This isn't an urban issue. It's not a rural issue. It's a statewide issue. Allowing local governments to certainly meet housing goals, but to conform to local values is extremely important. To conform to the identity of our unique jurisdictions, but at the same time, allowing that flexibility to do so has always been a challenge. Saying the right things around housing is great, but when you look again, as I mentioned, these housing controls and regulations when it comes to in particular zoning. this larger issue of housing, the mixed use of housing. When I look at jurisdictions like the city of Minneapolis that really revolutionized their approach to create inclusive housing and this inclusive approach by reducing those barriers to zoning and density and parking requirements. Certainly, it's easier said than done around here. I really appreciate Scott Wiener, all of his efforts to put forward a plan around concentrating housing around transit hubs and job centers. We certainly need to take that approach, but certainly because we're such a diverse state and there's so many interests that are impacted and every community is different, we've got to do it a little differently. I think that we can get there, but this pandemic can't get in the way of the progress we've made, and we've got to continue to push, because again, it's not about this idea around housing, about this great investment, this luxurious investment for the few. We have to think about housing, about the impacts it has on children, on families, and really creating opportunities for people to live meaningful lives in this state.
Absolutely. Okay, I think we have time for one last question. And this is from Manuel Valencia. In more affluent areas, particularly in the Monterey Peninsula, efforts to find land for affordable housing are too often thwarted by NIMBY attitudes disguised as environmental issues. How can we help you in your efforts to provide more affordable housing throughout Monterey County, including in the peninsula where there is a lot more open space?
Right, and so that's obviously a tricky question, and I think that when I mentioned that book I read, Golden Gates, and I actually got a rare book recently. I had it shipped from, I think, Europe, because it wasn't available anywhere else. It's called The Environmental Protection Hustle. It was a book by a Berkeley student written in the 70s, which talks exactly to this issue. You really, if I were to pick up this book and read it now, I would think it was written last year. But this was in the 70s, talking about how complex this housing debate is, and how years and years, and even from the 70s, 60s, and 70s, this housing crisis is certainly nothing new, and it really is a result of a lot of the housing controls that have been imposed over time at the local level. And certainly the state, in my opinion, needs to play a greater role in working with local jurisdictions, working within our regions to do what we can to reduce those barriers, to reduce those regulatory barriers when it comes to meeting housing goals, to be, again, innovative with how we think of our communities and the potential for new housing, because certainly this issue isn't going to go away. We are, an incredible state. This is a desirable place to live because of, so many different reasons, because of our, economic activity, because of our incredible amenities in this state. Our weather is, first to none. And so certainly this, those things aren't going to change. But certainly we can certainly meet housing goals and grow in a way that conforms to the history of our jurisdictions and the history of our regions. But it certainly is going to takes leadership, and it's going to take the right regulatory framework, and to have those difficult discussions. I myself understand the value of CEQA, but when CEQA is abused for specific reasons to block projects and really not focusing on the true environmental impacts of any project and try to mitigate those challenges. But when you have people way back in the 70s that used CEQA as a vehicle to block projects, that's a problem, and that's something that the legislature certainly needs to have a discussion, that the governor needs to step up and lead that discussion, because certainly when you talk about CEQA, it's like a third rail in state government. But certainly we've got to take a pragmatic approach and assess this these possible ways that we can approach this and create pathways that will put the state and in particular our local jurisdictions on a path to get the results that we want. And I certainly appreciate. I was in local government for 8 years. I understand the challenges when it comes to NIMBYism. You can't blame local jurisdictions for sounding the alarm bells about new growth because of lack of infrastructure. And certainly infrastructure should concern us all. And that's why we've got to really push the federal government, push state government to invest more in our communities so that way we can have the capacity, because congestion, historic rates of congestion in our region, that certainly is a threat to agriculture and free flowing transportation network, that impacts all of us. And certainly it's difficult to see that congestion get even worse. And so this is something that is a very complex issue to tackle, but I know that we can get there.
Right. Yeah, it's absolutely a holistic approach, which is what I'm hearing, as part of your answer. It really does need to be, addressed in multiple ways. So I actually think that's all the time we have today for folks. And I just wanted to thank the Assembly member for the opportunity to have this robust conversation with you. It has been incredibly enlightening, and we're really grateful for your leadership and your stewardship of these issues as they, really impact everybody in California and your district. So we just really want to say thank you very much for your time today, Assembly member.
Absolutely. Thank you guys so much. Sorry for the technical difficulties, but I really appreciate everyone being online, and please don't hesitate to contact our office for anything at all.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us today, for bearing with us through our technical challenges. We really appreciate and hope you enjoyed this event. Encourage you, if you liked what you heard from Assemblymember Rivas about the work he's doing, to share that with your legislators. If you liked what you heard from California YIMBY and are interested in future events, we are having a discussion with Randy Shaw, author of Generation Priced Out, next week on Thursday. And we love for you to sign up to volunteer with us. It's a great opportunity to learn more about this great housing work that legislators like Assemblymember Rivas are doing, and get involved to support these efforts to make sure California is truly for everyone. Hope you all have a lovely, lovely weekend.
Thank you all for attending. This event has been recorded, and archive will be available from cayimby.org/events after the show. Or you can visit our Facebook page at facebook.com/CAYIMBY.